Hello, ladies and gents, boys and girls, people of all ages, sexualities, and identities, and welcome back to another film review. And today's film review is, of course, Send Help. So, what is Send Help about? Well, in a nutshell, it's about a young woman getting bossed around by a shitty boss. Yeah, I'm going to use the word shitty because that's the best way to describe it. And essentially, she finds herself in a situation in which she has to try and survive on an island when their plane crashes. But let's take you back for a second. Let's take you right back to the very beginning to understand how this all happened. We are introduced to our protagonist who works in accounting at the office. She also seems to work in a lot of the financial parts of the business. However, when she begins to make a proposal in hopes of getting a raise and also getting put up in the company to a higher position, she finds her work has been stolen and she finds that the boss doesn't really seem to have any respect for her. She also begins to eat a tuna sandwich during her work shift and eventually finds herself essentially feeling like she's been degraded by the manager after she has an argument about not being given a rise, not being given a higher position, not being given a new job in the company. Even higher management agrees that she deserves to be boosted up, but her boss believes that she should be left at the bottom. This is due to his one, intolerance for the fact that she likes to eat tuna. And two, because he just feels like he doesn't see any worth in her as a character. He sees her as a very scruffy individual who has no value. But oh, how that will change. So she goes home after a bit of a sulk and feeling a little bit used, and finds herself in a position in which she essentially goes on to watch a survival show, which will become very, very key in what happens next. Now, one thing I should point out very quickly is the person who stole her idea, ironically, looks a lot like the guy from American Psycho. Not only the hair, but the costume in general. I don't know if this was intentional or just a bit of a laugh in the office. But to whoever put it in this film, good on you. And the next thing that happens is she gets on a flight with her boss, and they're supposed to be going over the sea to seal a deal. But the plane ends up hitting some turbulence and decides to crash into the ocean. On its way down, the guy who looks like American Psycho tries to nick her seat, and she just basically flings him out the window and then pulls down the shutter as he begins to bleed to death out the window. Once they crash into the sea, she manages to swim out of the aeroplane and finds herself on the island with her boss. She survives for a little while on a couple of her survival skills, but soon finds that she needs a new resource of sustenance. Now, her boss is badly injured due to the crash. His leg seems to be partially broken, or at least very, very badly injured. She tries to feed him fish, but due to his intolerance of tuna, he finds himself basically gagging at the seams, still trying to boss her around even though he is essentially in a very vulnerable position. After a while, she decides to leave him hour after hour after hour, leaving him there to sulk by himself. When she returns, she seems to have found a lot more food and sustenance and begins to basically mock him with it for a while. At least until he gives in and decides to help her along the way. After a while of surviving on the island, the two begin to admit a couple of secrets to one another, and she begins to warn him that whatever he does, he may not go by the eggs on the island. She even manages to kill a wild boar, which frankly is the only kind of down for me in this film because I think they went a little bit too far with the wild boar. The wild boar in this film looks a little bit too mechanic, and most importantly, it looks like it should be in a horror film. But moving past the bore, let's get more into the story. So essentially, it turns out that she keeps coming back with resources. He doesn't know where it's coming from. She even mocks him by making up her own sushi. However, she begins to realize after a while that a boat keeps coming to the island. He hasn't noticed this yet because he's on the other side of the island. But she doesn't quite know who exactly he is, and she doesn't want him to get rescued. So what she does is keeps up the false pretense that there is nothing beyond their part of the island. Eventually, however, she finds that his fiancée has turned up looking for him. After trying to guide his fiancée back to him, she decides that the better thing to do to keep him in check is to kill his fiancée and say that she never turned up. However, when he discovers the ring, she has to come up with some sort of scenario to explain exactly what's going on. Her explanation is the whole thing was an accident. However, he doesn't believe this and of course has already taken her knife. He goes to attack her brutally in the forest, but she manages to get a good jab in his side. After doing this, he manages to flee away from her for a little bit longer, prolonging his life a little bit. However, when he gets beyond the X on the island, he soon discovers the reason that she never wanted him to go there. It turns out that she discovered a private house on the island, stocked full of waters and fruit, and everything you could need to survive on an island. It turns out that because she's very good with numbers, she managed to remember the passcode. He manages to break in, and she manages to break the security cameras so that no one would know that either of them were ever inside of the house. When he begins to try and plead for mercy, she decides that he's not worth saving. And so she kills him, ironically, with the one thing that he pointed out would make her a very good asset in her company. She kills him with a golf club. Then we fade off to a moment in which she begins to talk about a self-help book that she's going to write, along with the fact that she has already successfully sold a book on her escape from the island and being the lone survivor of a crash, and the fact that that book got turned into a movie. Her final words to the camera is that nobody is coming to help. Another thing I should mention is she scaremongers him at one point in this film by essentially hinting that she's going to cut off his manhood, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. Of course, she doesn't do this, and she actually killed a rat. So, the film, Send Help. What did I think of this film overall? There were good moments and bad moments. One thing I liked the most is how they really kept referring to the film American Psycho, and this kind of madness behind how people go crazy and believe they've done things that they haven't actually done. However, there was a couple of downs for me. One was the hog. The second one, which I forgot to mention earlier, is after the death of his fiancée, she has this whole kind of madness infused dream in which she starts spewing across the beach and then imagines his fiancée as a zombie. Now, I like the idea of a far-fetched imagination, but I didn't quite get that before we actually see the zombie, why his fiancée comes crawling off the beach like a zombie. I know it's a subtle hint, but we could have just stuck to her coming up normally, going on about telling him the truth, and then turning into a zombie. But that's just my personal opinion. The other thing I like in this story is how it really digs down deep about the idea of how bosses treat their employees. I feel like that's the most important message out of this as a whole. Not necessarily the idea of people potting off their bosses, because of course that's, well, but this idea of people being treated like people, not being treated like machinery, not being treated like the get out of jail free card, which is exactly what she is in the beginning of this film. She's basically a way for the company to make money, but without actually giving her credit. So to see her turn in this film is no short of a kind of realism to this film. The only thing is, I wish that this film had been a little bit more serious, and for that reason I'm going to give it a solid 7 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, you beautiful people.